much. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. I hope you had a great lunch. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Laura Morgan Roberts to SIOPSA and to do this keynote. But before I introduce Laura, I must declare a conflict of interest here. So I am the chairperson of your fan club in South Africa. I'm particularly, particularly like the work that you've done around positive identity and restorative justice within the workplace. And I really loved how you use the examples from South Africa and Rwanda to think about restorative justice in the workplace. And so I'm afraid I am a big fan of your work. So let me introduce you, Laura, to our audience. So Dr. Laura Morgan Roberts is a professor of practice at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business. Laura's research and consulting focuses on the science of maximizing human capital in diverse organizations and communities. She has published over 50 research articles, teaching cases, and practitioner-oriented tools for strategically activating best selves through strength-based development. Her influential publications on diversity, authenticity, and leadership development have been featured in Harvard Business Review and several other global media outlets. And so Laura is here today to talk to us about cultivating and sustaining positive identities at work, implications for diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. Laura, a warm welcome to SIOPSA and a warm welcome, and we hope one day we could host you in person in South Africa.
Oh, I would love that. Thank you so much, Dr. Koch. Thank you, SIOPSA. Wonderful to be here with each of you. So grateful for the invitation and for the opportunity to engage in dialogue with you today. I'm looking forward to hearing some of your reflections and some of your feedback, because actually what I'm presenting is a bit more of a puzzle, than a series of puzzles, than it is a set of conclusions. So I'll say that straight off the gate, and then we'll move forward from there and see what we might discover. So an oriented question for the work that we've been invited to engage in is around industrial psychology being viewed as a force for the greater good. And as you know, from my introduction, this has been something around which I am particularly passionate. Spent the better part of a couple of decades as an organizational psychologist, trained at the University of Michigan, trying to use some of the tools and insights as a force for the greater good in society. Many of those endeavors focus on leadership and leading, not just with an efficiency or performance mindset, but also with a social justice mindset, thinking about generative processes and outcomes that help us to experience individual and collective thriving and flourishing in the context of our work. And so, as under industrial organizational psychologists, we tend to be somewhat interested, I would say, in questions around human motivation and in behavioral change, particularly in the workplace. And so that comes front and center into this conversation here around leading with a social justice mindset, because it's in part a matter of skill, but also, I would say, a matter of will. And the skill and will combination really create a set of powerful forces and dynamics that we find can both enable as well as undermine our ability to lead with a social justice mindset and create the dynamics that we desire. That is, our investment in our own sense of self and self-worth, this motivation and desire to cultivate and sustain a positive identity. It can be a powerful force for the greater good, but it can also create some real obstacles and barriers to generating the kind of outcomes that we truly seek or desire. Boiled down in a nutshell, we're always entertaining this balance and a set of questions about whether or not leading with a social justice mindset is going to produce a set of benefits that outweigh the costs. And from an identity and ego standpoint, the costs are, what will it cost me in terms of power, status, and also some practical or tangible resources? But layered onto that, will it make me look bad? Will it make me feel badly about myself? So we're going to talk about identity threat and some ways that we might mitigate identity threat. Here's an overview of our conversation today. First, I'm going to start by highlighting the shared aspiration that we bring into our work and into our world, that of cultivating and sustaining positive identities. But then we're going to go into a few challenges. Now, there's a shared challenge that transcends socio-demographic categories and other dimensions of difference. And it's a shared challenge around assessing and narrating our strengths. In short, I'm going to offer that we really don't know how good we are. And because of that gap in our understanding and our need to cultivate and sustain a positive identity, we often rely on imperfect mirrors and cognitive biases. These can be very helpful coping tactics for us, but they can also become problematic, as I'll start to unpack in our time together. Especially interested in inviting us to think about some intersectional challenges around assessing and narrating strengths and coping with identity threats. Things that high power groups, higher status groups do to cultivate and sustain their positive identities, especially when they're feeling threatened. And things that lower status, lower power individuals do, tactics that they use to try to cope with identity threats as well. Again, all in service of cultivating and sustaining these positive identities. So as we look at the aspirations and the challenges, and we evaluate them through an intersectional lens, it opens up a series of important questions and puzzles as well, I think, about generative pathways for leading diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. So let's start with this shared aspiration, cultivating and sustaining positive identities. Now, my colleagues and I, as I mentioned, have been exploring how we cultivate and sustain positive identities at work for several years. And we started with the premise that has been established by many, many leaders and researchers over centuries, that most individuals, seek to hold positive self-views, desire to be viewed positively by others, because our identity is in part a construction of how we feel about ourselves, but it's also informed by the kind of data, the feedback, the input that we get from other people's perceptions and reflections about us. So we engage in positive identity construction. This is an active process, not a static process. It's an ongoing process. It's a never-ending process where we're using images, stories, descriptions that are considered to be positive or valuable in some way to help to establish our sense of self, our sense of significance, our sense of place in the world. My colleagues and I conducted a review of a series of studies that have been conducted in organizations about how we cultivate and sustain positive identities at work. And through that, we developed a framework. Our shorthand for this framework is the GIVE model, the GIVE model of positive identity construction. Now, I'm going to come back to the GIVE model of positive identity construction later in the talk to explain the different components and how they might yield a generative pathway. But for now, what I want to highlight is that our research documented through this review of the literature, a series of positive outcomes that are associated with cultivating positive identities at work. So in many ways, we would say this is a noble pursuit. Okay, as we cultivate more positive identities at work, we have a higher sense of engagement, motivation, persistence, commitment, attachment, creativity, cooperation, helping, resilience, growth at work, and pro-social behavior like volunteering. So it's not just a positive self-construction, I think, therefore I am, in the words of Descartes, but it's also an enacted set of identities, a generative practices, that we are what we do. And we're merging those two together in this view or conceptualization of the positive identity using the give model. That's what helps to create the vitality and value creation that would constitute a quote unquote good life, not just good for self, but good for the collective, good for the whole. Now, these positive self-constructions don't always operate in tandem with our generative practices, right? So we're going to get to some of that in terms of the positive identity challenges. The fact that sometimes I might think things about myself and my positive characteristics and attributions that don't necessarily bear out in practice, and that can create some problems. But when we do have that synergy, when we have a more positive sense of self, and that's anchored and grounded through the social feedback that we're receiving, it stimulates positive emotions. This broadens and builds our thought action repertoires, as psychologist Barbara Fredrickson has established in a host of research. And then that provides more access to an additional set of important and valuable resources. That's what makes it a generative process, because it helps us to generate more resources that therefore promote these desirable outcomes like cooperation, helping, cognitive effort, complex logical reasoning, and problem solving. But it also, in addition to building the positive emotions, the positive identities also help us to build social resources. So we find in our research that when we cultivate and sustain positive identities using generative pathways, that we are able to increase the number, diversity, and quality of our interpersonal relationships. Okay, by feeling more positively about ourselves and having those views validated by others, we're fulfilling our human needs for belongingness, and that therefore promotes a number of positive health outcomes, such as thriving. It also promotes tangible instrumental outcomes, right? Access to information through having a more diverse social network, and it promotes resilience. We have the social support, the social resources that we need to endure hardship and demanding challenges. So, in short, cultivating and sustaining positive identities is a shared aspiration. There are a number of positive benefits that result. And so we are deeply invested in this ongoing process of cultivating and sustaining positive identities. This is a relational process. That's important to highlight here because it also sets the context for some of the pros and cons that unfold from this process. But the four key components here are claiming, so claiming an identity, putting forth a claim that one is a caring, kind, considerate person, and then having someone else to grant that identity. In the space of leadership, Sue Ashford and Scott DeRue of the University of Michigan published research on how leadership identities are positive interpersonal identities that are claimed and granted. So one enacts leadership, but others then have to also respond in kind, validate and affirm that act of leadership, therefore granting the leadership identity to the person. So through these interactions, we are interpreting our environment, our place in our environment, and the positivity of our identity or the lack thereof, right? Because identities can be validated, but they can also be invalidated. And that sense-making process of validation and or invalidation then leads us to change, shift the ways that we think about ourselves and the ways that we present ourselves. Now let's get into the shared challenge that we all face. There's a shared aspiration. There's also a shared challenge. And the shared challenge is we really don't know how good we are. That's my shorthand for highlighting the shared challenge. Let's just look at some of the mixed messages that we receive in our world from voices of some well-established, popularly known leaders, some scholar practitioners like Adam Grant. Then you also have some entrepreneurial celebrities like Oprah. And they're telling us on the one hand, know yourself. Don't believe all the hype. Don't believe everything good people tell about you. But then on the other hand, you have people saying, no, trust your gut, trust your gut. Don't let others convince you that your idea is good if you in your gut think that it's bad. And Oprah comes down and says, don't be confused between what people say you are and who you or how you know you are. Well, that already is presenting a bit of a challenge or a conundrum. How are we supposed to make sense of what's the truth, what isn't the truth, what are the different filters that we should use? Okay, so let's add a little more drama to this conundrum. What I've also learned in the research on cultivating positive identities is that we experience a praise deficit. We experience a praise deficit. So you already have people trying to cobble together a sense of who we are in a more positive and generative way. But then you've got the audience, our relational partners, our interactors, who in essence withhold praise because they don't think that we value their opinion or their expressions of gratitude or the granting. So many people underestimate the positive impact of compliments and gratitude expressions, and therefore they withhold them. Then you also have our theories of motivation, which suggests that for many people, our theories of use are that we're more motivated by negative feedback than positive feedback. So this research that shows that managers and leaders avoid giving positive feedback at work to a greater extent than they avoid giving negative feedback at work. And in general, managers and leaders are fairly avoidant when it comes to giving feedback, quality feedback at work. And so as a result, recent studies show that many people just underestimate how much others like them. So what do we do to fill in the gaps? Oh boy, here's where it really starts to get a little bit dicey. So how are we filling in the gaps? Well, in a review article by Dunning, Hells and Souls, they state, and I'm quoting here directly because I think they capture it in such a rich way, people are often motivated to reach flattering conclusions about themselves and their place in the world. Thus, they mold, manage, and massage the feedback the world provides them so that they can construe themselves as lovable and capable people. The psychological literature is replete with demonstrations of all of the tricks and techniques people use to construct and maintain desirable images of themselves while avoiding negative ones. What do we mean? Well, let's look at self-enhancement biases. As individuals lack relevant information and often engage in self-confirmatory biases so that we neglect valuable information, this translates into overinflated views of our own expertise, skill, and character along many dimensions. We overestimate our ability to bring about desirable events, like the likelihood that we're going to win, or how charitable we think that we will be in the future, or even our proclivity to vote. We overestimate the likelihood that we will engage in those activities and bring about desirable events. We underestimate time to complete tasks. Guilty as charged. Raise your hand if that's you. I know a lot of us are here on that one today. And have overconfidence in judgment and prediction. We also have flawed self-assessments of learning and academic performance. As a professor, I can just say that I have experienced that many, many times in classroom environments. Why didn't I get an A on this assignment? And so on and so forth. Why did I not get the top score in the class? What we've also seen over the past 2 years is quite sobering. Some of the things are a little more lighthearted and less consequential. Others do become even more sobering. Unrealistic estimations of health risk. We have seen that manifest in profound ways, and it's created quite a bit of social trauma and public health risk and subsequent loss of life in the face of global pandemics and other challenges. But it's all part of this pattern of self-enhancement biases, not really knowing how good we are, therefore relying on imperfect mirrors and cognitive biases. As the phrase, as the common phrase is presented in the US, adding insult to injury. Adding insult to injury is the role that our biased assessments, stereotypes, schemas, prototypes, and power dynamics play in this process. Not knowing how good we are is a challenge across the board, but I'm looking at Ramona's question here and in the chat, which is, what about people who don't know who they are? If you're uncertain about yourself and who you believe, you see, and others are, is it unswayed? It could be, there are a number of factors that really layer into this. This is, I think, where for many people, a lot of the diversity dynamics come into play as well. There are gender differences in self-enhancement biases. So first we'll note that. Who do you think has the stronger self-enhancement bias of the individuals who are sex assigned at work? That would actually be men. Men, people who are assigned male at birth are more likely to have self-enhancement or report self-enhancement biases than women. There are gender and racial differences in contribution valuation. There are gender and racial differences in performance assessments. Okay, I'm going to read to you, highlight a few studies here, just to flesh this out a little bit. So men and women often receive a different quality and form of performance feedback. For example, subjective assessment, ambiguous assessments like leadership potential, executive presence, they favor dominant groups. So women receive more vague praise more often than men, including comments like, "You had a great year," alongside some vague critiques of communication style. "Oh, your communication style is a little off-putting, you're a little too aggressive." Now, this is compared to specific developmental feedback linked to business outcomes, which male counterparts are more likely to receive. Okay. Taking charge is associated with the highest performance ratings for men, but not for women. This is research out of Stanford with Shelley Carell and colleagues, 2020. Women are also less likely to receive positive recognition and remuneration for their leadership contributions. So Joyce Fletcher documented in the late 90s that women leaders are more likely to engage in invisible, unrewarded, and acknowledged work. So caregiving, office housework, relational practice. But women also have been, over the past couple of years, leading more employee well-being initiatives than their male counterparts, which have been very important during a global pandemic. And women of color have been leading the most diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, according to McKinsey, leanin.org, as well as research by Wharton. But there's an important study that shows that when members of minoritized groups are leading these types of initiatives, they experience career penalties for doing so. Okay, not only are they not rewarded for these contributions, but they are actually penalized for those contributions. So that's one element to consider in contribution valuation. And why certain individuals who are members of lower status groups are not receiving the same quality of feedback and therefore not receiving the same input to be able to construct and sustain their positive identities. I'm going to give you some more statistics from a recent study just came out last week from Textio, 25,000 people performance feedback data, and they found language bias in performance feedback. I think this, Rob, may speak to your question a bit about leadership being a gendered construct itself. I don't think it is inherently, but in an interpretation and an evaluation, yes, we definitely see some gendered and racialized trends and patterns. So gender bias, compared to men, women are 7 times more likely to report being described as opinionated and 11 times more likely to report being described as abrasive in their performance evaluations, while men are 3 times more likely to report being described as confident and 3.7 times more likely to report being described as ambitious. Women receive 22% more feedback about their personality than men do, and 30% more exaggerated feedback than men. Women over 40 receive 4 times the amount of feedback that's not actionable compared to younger white men. There's age bias. People under 40 report being described as ambitious 2.5 times more than people over 40. People over 40 are more likely to be called responsible and unselfish, though, than younger workers, because you've got some age dynamics going on in there as well. Racial bias. These are US. This is more US based. But I know that there are, racial parallels and power dynamics as well around the world. Racial bias, that Asian people got more feedback than all people of any other race in this study. They got 25% more feedback than white people. Black men got the least feedback of all. Black and Latinx people reported being described as passionate over twice as often as their colleagues. Okay, and they received 2.5 times more feedback that was not actionable. So it's feedback about your personality, but it's not actionable feedback that's corresponding to your performance, and that would enable you to develop further. Black women actually received 9 times more feedback that wasn't actionable compared to white men under 40. White men under 40, however, though, was receiving feedback that used the word brilliant almost 9 times as often, 9 times more than women over 40. So I'll just stop there, but just note, the feedback doesn't have to be negative to be low quality. Some of this feedback, some might say, is positive feedback that's being given to members of minoritized groups, but it's not specific enough. It's not delivered in a form that enables employees to learn and grow from it. And there's other research, which I won't go into as much detail today, that suggests that this feedback, the positive feedback, is often gratuitous. It's not sincere. It's not genuine. It's not actionable. There's been additional research that shows that members of high power groups will at times overcompensate in trying to give more positive feedback, but it's still, to lower power groups, it's still more stereotypical, and it's motivated by their drive or their concern to cultivate and sustain their own positive identity, rather than being driven by their desire to try to help the other group to learn, grow, and develop. I'll circle back to that in a few minutes. Let me make a couple of more points before we get there. One, and just to highlight here, what I've just shared with you is a series of statistics that highlight patterns of bias. Now, for many people, especially for people who are members of high power groups, they have a very hard time receiving this kind of data. The tendency, again, driven by the same positive identity motivations that I highlighted earlier, the tendency is to have a positive bias toward our own objectivity. So we underestimate our personal biases across the board. We also, though, at the same time, are relying on downward comparisons to other individuals, references, or to other groups in order to elevate our sense of self-worth. that there's in-group favoritism bias, and so that when we're successful, that individuals that we consider part of our in-group, if they are successful as well, we think it's because they were just that good. If they fail, then we make an internal attribution for their success. I'm sorry, if they fail, if it's a member of our group, us or a member of our group, we make an external attribution for our success. Oh, it was just a really tough day. You know, there were a lot of contextual factors. You know, the market was really bad. You know, market was down that day. So in-group favoritism bias inflates our own role in success and minimizes our own role in failure. But we do the opposite with our groups. We do the opposite with our out groups. You know, so do these patterns play out across sexual orientation as well? Yes, they do, absolutely. People are making downward comparisons as they consider their own group. And in shorthand, and this is where it's quite troubling, boosting ourselves up, our own sense of self, through pushing other people down, right, psychologically, but sometimes in more of a concrete way as well. Okay, so this can create some inequity paradoxes as individuals think that they are more objective. That belief, I'm an objective person, I'm fair, I'm not biased, that belief actually translates into more hiring biases. Okay, so you can see here there's research by several scholars. I think Castillo's research on meritocracy and the myth of meritocracy is the most compelling in this domain, that managers who think they're rewarding others on merit are less likely to do so and more likely to sustain inequality through biased practices. Okay, we see a similar pattern around color blindness, the belief, the deeply held belief that an individual doesn't see color. If I believe that about myself, I'm actually more likely to engage in biased behavior toward Black and brown people and toward people of color. The more powerful you are, is a saying in the US, you're more likely to drink your own bath water. The more powerful you are, the more likely you are to endorse meritocratic beliefs toward success. Okay, so what we see here now are some intersectional challenges. We have shared challenges. We in general don't know how good we are, but the socio-categorical biases also threaten positive identities. So how do we cope with these positive identities, and what may be some paths forward? The first thing to offer up is that high status group members, according to research from Nicole Shelton at Princeton and Jennifer Richardson at Yale, they've been conducting this research for a couple of decades around intergroup relations. They're showing that interpersonal interactions highlight the fault lines, as you see pictured here, between groups. And so high status group members are concerned with proving their character. That's the positive identity motivation for high status groups, proving that they're a likable person, whereas lower status group members are more concerned with proving competence. So it's not about being liked, but it's more about being respected. And in the college context of the workplace, as well as in higher education, being respected as a skilled, knowledgeable person. Now, keep those two motivations in mind as we start to talk about how people cope, how members of these different groups cope with threats to their positive identities. I use this scenario in a lot of my consulting and my teaching. I thought that many of you might be able to relate to these types of interactions when it comes to having conversations about inclusion and exclusion. You have one person who says, I feel like we have a very welcoming atmosphere and we work hard to help everyone feel like they belong. And then another person responds, well, actually, there have been some times when I haven't felt like I belong. Like when I get invited to join the conversation about a project, or I don't get invited to join the conversation about a project that I'm working on, or if I'm not invited for barbecue or social hour with my teammates. And then another person chimes in, wow, I've never had an experience like that. You sure you were excluded on purpose? I mean, do they know you want to be involved? So this cartoon here, for those who can see it, it has three people sitting at a table, and there's a man sitting in the middle, and there's a woman on his left and a woman on the right. The woman on the left appears to have light skin, perhaps white, as the man and the woman on the right appears to have brown skin. And so the caption at the bottom reads, "Oh, that's strange. I remember it differently, in a way that aligns with my worldview and casts me in a positive light." You might think that's harsh, but it really captures what I have observed in the literature in terms of ego defensive routines and having conversations about bias that are motivated and driven by positive identities. But it also highlights what I have witnessed in my organizational consulting, and consulted with several top Fortune 50 firms, top higher education institutions around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'm actively involved with practitioners. They're often, ask me to come in and help them to understand more about some of the patterns, some of the challenges that people are experiencing in the organizations. And then there are ways of collectively reframing those data around biases and challenges. For instance, oh, well, thanks goodness we're not that bad anymore, as in those data must be outdated. Or, it's not my fault. Things are, we do have some problems somewhere out there in the organization or out there in society, but the leader or leaders don't necessarily take ownership for the source of the problem or for the solutions of the problem. And then there's the sparkly object when it comes to challenges around bias. So well, other people are struggling too. Okay, so you said Black women have 9 times more data or feedback that's not actionable, that's not helpful. But white women are struggling too. White women don't necessarily have it easy. So let's make sure that we talk about them as well. And what's really happening in this discourse, in this conversation, is continuing to move toward the experiences and the needs of the dominant group to feel included and to feel like they are belonging and at the center. And that in and of itself is not problematic. It becomes problematic when members of the dominant group invested in seeing themselves as good people. And for that, I would reference Dolly Chugg's book, The Person You Mean to Be, from New York University, The Person You Mean to Be. But invested in seeing themselves as good people, even those who hold biases will then deny the personal privilege that they hold and the existence or impact of biased actions, thus stifling or stymieing our ability to lead effective change. There have been so many promises and widespread commitments, particularly coming from US-led firms over the past 2 years around anti-racist efforts. But I know this conversation is nothing new for those of you in South Africa. I visited South Africa to teach a couple of times when I was on the faculty at Harvard Business School and had the opportunity to teach in executive programs in Johannesburg. And so there are times and spaces in which we focus on the historical and contemporary violence and oppression of Black people, as we did when George Floyd was murdered in 2020. Those conversations quickly become more inclusive and more expansive to focus on injustice and marginalization of other groups, which again, in and of itself is not problematic if we're still addressing the needs of each of the groups and all of the groups in turn to the extent that we can, and to the extent that we're aligning our commitments with our actions and our outcomes. But often what happens is that we find the set of issues, challenges, or problems within diversity and equity inclusion discourse that are most comforting, that feel most proximate, that create more of a sense of security and belongingness for the dominant group, and the specific experiences and hardship of the marginalized groups, such as Black workers, are not being addressed. So we start to highlight conversations in our diversity, equity, inclusion discourse around introversion, unconscious bias, fragility, virtues, and so forth, that are important pieces of the puzzle, but certainly not the entire puzzle. But we avoid having some of the conversations that feel more threatening or more or more difficult. Study by Trey Walter Richardson and Shelton in 2009 documented what we are seeing and witnessing today. Again, I'm coming from a US context, and currently in the US, we're finding widespread resistance, discourse, and even political legislation that seeks to censor and outlaw race-related discussions in classrooms and in workplaces. As Trey Walter and colleagues highlighted that race-related discussions are likely to be quite threatening, at least for whites who are not accustomed to thinking about race-related issues and who are concerned about appearing prejudiced. So remember what I showed you earlier, the positive identity motives for dominant groups anchored in being liked. For lower status groups, they anchor in a desire to be respected. So Bell and Hartman highlighted this again, like 15 years ago, 2008, that diversity, equity, inclusion lands very well when we stick to the happy talk, quote unquote, happy talk. So then they surveyed individuals to find out what their enthusiasm was around DEI, and learned that the enthusiasm was actually quite strong and quite favorable for talking about many of the issues and challenges that I highlighted that the dominant group can relate to and that people feel more comfortable with. But when they explicitly asked about race and race-related conversations, very different experience. No longer the same appetite for that kind of discussion or conversation. So just highlighting, as I mentioned here, some of the trends in the US around attempting to legislate and local school boards through statewide governors, and even under former President Donald Trump, a national ban, an executive order that helped for 3 months in the last quarter of 2021, banning diversity training that could in any way make white people feel uncomfortable about themselves. There's a set of parallel proposals and legislations that are currently being enacted across the US around LGBTQ plus shorthand in the state of Florida, legislation that don't say gay, same in the state of Tennessee, that you're not to speak of sexual orientation unless you're speaking of cisgendered heterosexual family units and individuals. The last piece that I will highlight here, this is a clip from an Academy Award-winning movie, The Help, Viola Davis, one of my favorite actresses. But what I want to highlight here is that this is also this need or the desire to be seen as a good person. It doesn't just become the ongoing challenge or the burden or the struggle of the member of the dominant group, but in fact becomes the work of the marginalized, the subordinate group. Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, is a very powerful book I highly recommend that you read it. I think that you'll find some parallels in terms of social structure in South Africa. For those of you who are based in South Africa, I've certainly found some in the US. She speaks to Nazi Germany. She also speaks to caste systems in India. But part of the work of the lower caste, the lot of the lower caste, the lower rung of power and status in a society, is to uphold, to continue to affirm and reinforce the positive identity of the more dominant group. So this creates a set of challenges for members of lower status groups in needing to not only cope with threats to their own positive identities, but also to carry the weight of positively enhancing, assuaging, reinforcing, comforting the identities of members of dominant groups who seek or desire to be liked, to be validated in their position of power and status, and to be reassured that they are not seen or perceived as racist, sexist, biased, unfair, homophobic, or any of classist or any of the other isms that seem to be socially inappropriate and that would therefore threaten their positive identities. So I've actually conducted a lot more research on the experiences of marginalized groups than I've conducted primary research on the experiences of dominance. I've done a lot of work on intersectionality with race, gender, and class. And so within that, in that domain, I'm just giving you one highlight summary of that research, one takeaway of that research, which is that as individuals in lower status groups are processing and coping with these levels of threat and concern, it imposes a tax, a cognitive tax, an emotional tax, and it leads to the suppression of resources, at times the exploitation of resources by those same individuals, and that is challenging. So without giving more details on that, let's go to the summary here of what we've covered today, and then I'll offer an invitation as we move to close. The summary is that we don't know how good we are, right? That many of our social comparison and self-enhancement schemas are biased, and that ego identity threats can trigger our ego defensive routines, which therefore can compromise positive identity development. So how do we shift? How do we get unstuck? How do we get unstuck from seeing ourselves and trying to be positive through the view of the best to being positive from the view of our best selves, giving our best offerings, providing our best contributions to society, not in a zero-sum scarcity view of our identity and of our organizations that focuses on the comfort and leads us to be reactionary and guarded and therefore depletes our resources, but really helps us to grow and progress in a more developmental, exploratory, and visionary way. And with this, I'll offer you 4 pieces from the GIVE model, which I said I'd circle back to. What we found particularly compelling as a positive identity infusion is to see ourselves as growing. How are we developing and adapting in a positive direction that facilitates a sense of progress? Second, integrating. How are we weaving together different facets and dimensions of ourselves that enhance authenticity and creativity? Third, virtuous action. Remember, not just being positive in our head, but just we are what we do. How are we manifesting practices that enact character strengths and make valued contributions? And finally, then we can get into a more solid basis of self-worth that is more sustainable, elevating a sustainable sense of self-worth. I recommend the Reflected Best Self exercise that my colleagues and I have developed to help accelerate along this path. And I'll close here with a quote from Maya Angelou. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel.
Powerful. Wow. Thank you, Dr. Roberts, for that impactful presentation. What stands out for me about what you presented is just, how grounded your work is in the science and how practical you are, not only within the education, but also the consulting work that you do. And this last kind of give model is just talks to how practical the work is that you have, that you do. And I, of course, as I said, I'm a big fan of your work. We need to close in a couple of minutes. There's been a lot of discussion. It's really hard to follow because it's 370 people. So I wonder whether we have an opportunity for perhaps for one question, and then we would unfortunately have to close out, or perhaps two at a max. Anyone particularly? So there's a number of Bongi, Rob, Sharon, Ramona, a couple of people that have made comments that as I was following. Shalene, any particular person want to ask a question? Just put your hand up and then we'll give you an opportunity. So one of the things while we're thinking, Dr. Roberts, you were talking about this being US based. There's a lot of commonalities to this context in South Africa. Our difference is that we, as a majority, are the lowest status group. Right? So Black people represent that low status group, whereas white people, men, heteronormative, heterosexual people represent kind of that dominant group. And so there's lots of parallels in terms of, as you talk about this work to the South African context. And one of the things that we've done in the society, SIOPSA, is really not to have the happy talk, and we've really adopted CRA as a way of having a conversation about race as well. What would your guidance be around, how do we navigate this very difficult space? And then we'll give Rob an opportunity to ask a question as well.
Yes, I think the first I would highlight is that I've been more and more appreciative of the understanding of global majority and what it means to see oneself, even in a US context, as a member of a global majority and not as a member of the minority. I think that many constituents within the US are being threatened by the shifting demographics and the recognition that, I would say, not just numerically, but also politically, many of the views around oppression and exclusion are in the minority. The vast majority of people want to live differently, want to work differently. I have to believe that. That's what keeps me going. So that's the first thing that I would highlight. I think, that there's a parallel, but I also think that is what invokes the threat. What's helpful is to continue to remind people of the widespread interest and energy and investment in living in ways that are more generative and to help to cultivate and sustain it in that way. It's the mindset of scarcity that triggers the ego defensive routine. Yep. The competition and scarcity triggers it.
Yeah. Love that. And I love that generative path that you talk about. Rob, you have a question?
Hi, Rob.
Thanks, Lorraine. And thank you, Prof. I must say, this is definitely one of the presentations I can't wait to watch the recording of. There were so many great stats and interesting insights on the slides there. I was hoping if you could perhaps comment on the topic of allyship. I know it's a big topic in North America. It's something that's growing in our context, but I think as we've ascertained, our context is similar, but also very different with regards to the majority and minority, and our very, very recent history of racial oppression that is both systemic and systematic. And I was just wondering, I'd love to hear some of your views on the topic of allyship with regards to social justice in this topic today.
Absolutely. I think that's a great question, Rob, and a great place for us to land. Because I started with that slide of leading requires a social justice leading with the social justice mindset. that, you know, it's okay, what will it cost me? Will it make me look bad? Will it make me feel bad? And, you know, what do I stand to gain? What do I stand to benefit? That is the allyship dynamic. That is the allyship tension. You know, there are many people who want to be viewed as allies because it makes them feel better about themselves, to kind of have that label and to have that affirmation, but they don't want to risk, you know, social favor, you know, social currency for many of them. You know, for many others, it's also physical safety, and that, you know, there are very real risks in physical safety, and I don't want to minimize those. For a lot of people in positions of privilege and power, you know, they would like to be generous, that is, but through a charitable perspective. Like, let me give you a little bit extra, but I'm not trying to give you something that might cost me now or in the future. And so one of my colleagues, Sarah Kaplan, and I wrote a short op-ed for Bloomberg in 2020 about allyship. And we said that there are three pieces. It's step in front, step aside, and step back. And so allies have to know when it's time for them to step in front and lead, when it's time to step aside, you know, walk by somebody else's side when another leader, but also time to step back, you know, give somebody else a seat at the table, because in many of the things, opportunities that we have, there are finite opportunities and lead, you know, to be in the room. And in those moments of scarcity, somebody has to be willing to sort of step aside or step back so that other people can enter in. I know that's really, really challenging with the EEO, you know, legislation over the past several decades in South Africa, but it, you know, I think that's a lot at the heart of it. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful advice. Sharon, we've got time for one short question, and then we need to wrap up.
Very, very tiny. Just a big thank you to Laura, and a kind request for information, your article, your research. I think it's going to help us as a society because it's relevant and practical. Thank you so much for enlightening us today.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you. So, Laura, is there perhaps a website? I think you have a personal website that folk can access some of your research. So perhaps if you could put that in the chat, and we can also make that available, because I know you've got lots of work that is available. But while you're doing that, I wanted to say, Laura, thank you very much for being available for SIOPSA and sharing your nuggets of wisdom and experience and science that you've learned as an industrial and organizational psychologist. And you've really kind of contributed to our conversation of how we could contribute to the greater good as IOPs and industrial psychologists. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to when we can invite you to South Africa to an in-person conference. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much. You have a great day too. And now you've got the day ahead of you still.
Yes.
Thank you very much.